The stars had never looked so crowded. Grand Admiral Velcor stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Divine Mandate, and stared at the blue and green world spinning slowly below him, like a jewel that did not yet know it had been stolen. 10,000 warships of the Zarathi Dominion filled the space around Earth in every direction, arranged in concentric rings of iron and fire that stretched from low orbit all the way out past the moon. Dreadnoughts the size of mountains sat beside siege carriers loaded with enough ordnance to crack continents open like eggs, and behind them floated the planet crackers, weapons so terrible that most species surrendered the moment they saw even one of them appear on their sensors. Velcor had brought 12. He was not a cruel being by nature, but he was efficient, and the Zarathi Dominion had not conquered 4,000 worlds across 3 galaxies by being gentle about it. Every species reacted the same way. When they saw the fleet arrive, panic, denial, bargaining, and then surrender. It always ended with surrender. He pressed a claw against the communications panel and opened a broad-spectrum transmission that would reach every single device on the planet below. Every phone, every television, every radio, every screen in every home and office and vehicle. His voice rolled across the entire world like thunder. Species designation: human. You are encircled. 10,000 warships of the Zarathi Dominion now occupy your orbital space. Your system has been sealed. No transmissions will leave. No vessels will escape. You will surrender all governmental authority, disarm immediately, and submit to species-level indenture. You have one standard rotation to comply. Resistance is a mathematical impossibility. He released the transmission button and leaned back in his command chair with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done this many times. Before, on the planet below, the world erupted into chaos. News networks screamed headlines across every channel. Governments scrambled to assemble emergency sessions. Military forces around the globe went to their highest alert levels, even though every general and admiral knew in their gut that nothing they had could touch a fleet like the one hanging above them. Fighter jets meant nothing against warships that could shrug off nuclear weapons. Tanks and missiles and aircraft carriers were toys compared to what floated in orbit. Panic spread through cities like wildfire. People ran through streets, held their families, prayed to whatever gods they believed in, and waited for the end of everything they had ever known. But deep beneath the surface of the Swiss Alps, 3 kilometers underground, in a cavern the size of a cathedral, there was no panic at all. Commander Lyra Osei sat in a chair at the center of the Solar Defense Communion's command hub and watched the Zarathi transmission play across her screen with an expression that could only be described as mild annoyance. She was a tall woman in her early 50s, with short gray hair and steady hands, and eyes that had seen enough classified information over the past 20 years to make most people lose sleep for the rest of their lives. Around her, 3,000 operators worked at their stations, in calm and focused silence, running calculations, checking systems, confirming coordinates, and monitoring the 10,000 red icons that filled the holographic display of near-Earth space like a swarm of angry insects. The Solar Defense Communion did not officially exist. It had no entry in any government budget, no mention in any public record, no office building with a sign on the door. It was the single most classified institution in human history, created 40 years ago when a small team of astronomers had detected faint electromagnetic signals coming from deep space, signals that were clearly artificial and clearly pointed at Earth's solar system. Those signals were Zarathi scouts mapping humanity's home for future conquest. The world's governments had faced a choice that night: hope that whatever was out there would be friendly, or prepare for the possibility that it would not be. They chose to prepare. 40 years of secret work followed. the brightest scientists and engineers from every nation on Earth, working together in underground facilities scattered across the planet and beyond, building something that no alien sensor could detect because it was buried beneath rock and ice and stone on every major body in the solar system. They called it Project Aegis, and today, for the first time in its existence, it was going to be used. Osei picked up the communicator on her console and opened a channel to the Zarathi fleet, using a frequency she had pulled directly from their own. Transmission. Her voice was calm and unhurried, the voice of someone who had been expecting this call for a very long time. Message received. We need about 6 hours, not to decide, just to finish calibrating. Aboard the Divine Mandate, Velkor's officers exchanged glances of amusement. His intelligence cast, the analysts who had spent years studying humanity from afar, pulled up their reports and confirmed what they had always believed. Humans had no interstellar navy, no orbital defense platforms, no planetary shields, no weapons capable of reaching orbit with any meaningful force. By every metric the Zarathi used to assess a species' threat level, Earth scored so low it was almost embarrassing. The humans were short-lived creatures who rarely exceeded a single century of life. They spent most of their history fighting each other over patches of dirt and disagreements about ideas. They were emotional and sentimental and prone to irrational attachment to other living things, including animals they kept in their homes for no productive reason whatsoever. They were, in the professional opinion of the Zarathi intelligence cast, not even worth the fleet that had been sent to collect them. Velkor agreed with this assessment entirely. He told his officers to let the humans have their 6 hours. It would make no difference. Let them run around and panic and come to terms with their new reality. He poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter on his command desk and watched the blue planet turn beneath him, and felt nothing but the quiet boredom of routine. He did not know that beneath the surface of Earth and the Moon and Mars and Europa and Titan and inside the scattered rocks of the asteroid belt, thousands of systems were waking up from a long sleep, warming their cores, charging their capacitors, aligning their targeting arrays, and connecting to each other through a quantum entangled web of communication that no Zarathi sensor had ever been designed to detect. He did not know that every single one of his 10,000 warships had already been assigned a designation in a targeting system that had been waiting for this exact moment for 4 decades. He did not know that the calm woman who had answered his transmission was not afraid because she had absolutely no reason to be. And he did not know that the 6 hours he had so generously granted were not for the humans to prepare themselves emotionally for surrender. They were for the humans to finish aiming. Commander Osei watched the calibration percentages climb across her displays. 60%, 70, 80, and allowed herself a small and very private smile. The Zarathi thought they were predators circling helpless prey. They had no idea they had just locked themselves inside a cage with something far worse than anything they had ever conquered. Clock ticked forward. The calibration continued. And Earth, quiet, blue, and beautiful, waited with the patience of a creature that had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing in any room is the one that does not look dangerous at all. 40 years is a long time for a secret. It is long enough for a child to be born, grow up, have children of their own, and never once suspect that beneath the ground they walk on, there is a machine capable of tearing holes in the fabric of space itself. It is long enough for 3 generations of scientists to live and die inside classified facilities, never publishing a single paper, never receiving a single award, never telling their families what they truly did for a living. It is long enough to change the destiny of an entire species, if the secret holds. And the secret had held. Commander Lyra Osei stood in the center of the command hub beneath the Swiss Alps and watched the final calibration numbers climb past 90% on the massive holographic display that filled the cavern like a constellation made of light. Around her, the 3,000 operators of the Solar Defense Communion worked in silence that was almost sacred. Across consoles, voices murmuring coordinates and confirmation codes into headsets, every single person in the room, aware that the moment they had trained their entire careers for, had finally arrived. Osei had been part of the Communion for 26 years, recruited straight out of the military after she had shown a talent for the kind of calm thinking that most people could only manage when nothing important was happening. She had risen through the ranks not because she was the smartest or the most aggressive, but because she was the steadiest. The kind of person who could watch the world end on a screen and still ask the right question at the right time. And right now, the right question was simple. Was Aegis ready? Project Aegis had begun 40 years ago in a small room in Geneva, where a group of exhausted astronomers had presented their findings to a closed meeting of world leaders. Findings that proved beyond any doubt that an alien intelligence was actively surveying Earth's solar system. The signals they had intercepted were not random. They were methodical and precise, and they followed patterns that matched what a military organization would use to map a territory before invasion. The world leaders had argued for 3 days. Some wanted to go public, to tell humanity the truth and rally the entire species to prepare together. Others pointed out that any alien civilization capable of reaching Earth's solar system would almost certainly be monitoring human communications, and that going public would be the same as telling the enemy exactly how much you knew and how afraid you were. In the end, secrecy won. A hidden coalition was formed, funded through buried budget lines and classified accounts, drawing the best minds from every nation on Earth, with the single mission of building a defense system capable of protecting the planet against a threat that might not arrive for decades. Arrive tomorrow. The first breakthrough came from the alien signals themselves. Human scientists did not just listen to the Zarathi transmissions. They pulled them apart, studied every frequency and modulation, and found within them traces of physics that human science had never imagined. The signals used a form of graviton manipulation that allowed information to travel through folded space, a principle that human physicists had theorized about in the most abstract terms but had never come close to proving. Within 5 years, human engineers had not only proven the theory, but had built a working prototype. Within 10 years, they had weaponized it. The first component of Aegis was called the Loom, and it was the most terrifying weapon ever created by human hands. The Loom was not a single device, but a network of thousands of spatial distortion nodes buried beneath the surface of every major body in the solar system: Earth, the Moon, Mars, Europa, Titan, Ceres, and dozens of large asteroids in the belt. When activated together, the nodes could fold local space, not to travel through it like the Zarathi did, but to move things that were already inside it. Anything within the solar system could be relocated, shifted from one set of coordinates to another in the blink of an eye. Including, for example, a warship, moved just far enough that it now occupied the exact same space as another warship. The result of two solid objects occupying the same space at the same time was not complicated. It was catastrophic. The second component was the Sable Array, a series of directed energy weapons hidden beneath planetary surfaces and powered by relay stations orbiting inside Mercury's orbit that siphoned energy directly from the sun. Each Sable installation could fire a beam of concentrated stellar energy, not plasma, not laser, not kinetic, but a form of directed graviton-photon fusion that the Communion scientists had invented entirely from scratch. The beams did not burn through armor or overload shields the way conventional weapons did. They simply broke molecular bonds at the target site, causing solid matter to come apart at the atomic level. Ships hit by sable fire did not explode. They dissolve, like sugar dropped into boiling water. The third component was the swarm. Millions of autonomous kill vehicles called houndsats, each one no larger than a football, stored in hollowed-out asteroids throughout the belt. Each houndsat carried a micro-singularity warhead, a device that created a tiny black hole lasting only a nanosecond, just long enough to swallow whatever it touched before collapsing back into nothing. They were fast, cheap, and almost impossible to stop in large numbers, and there were very large numbers of them. The fourth and final component was the Ghost Line, a quantum-entangled communications network that connected every single element of Aegis across the entire solar system with instantaneous, undetectable, and completely unjammable communication. No delay, no signal to intercept, no way to disrupt coordination between installations that were millions of kilometers apart. Together, these four systems formed a weapon that did not look like a weapon at all. No visible installations, no ships, no orbital platforms, nothing for an invading fleet to target or even detect. It looked like nothing. And that was the point. The calibration display reached 98%, then 99%. Osei felt her heart beat once, very hard in her chest, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to happen. She had spent her entire adult life preparing for this moment, and she had always hoped it would never come. That the Zarathi would pass Earth by, that the signals would stop, that the threat would fade into history as just another false alarm had come. 10,000 warships in orbit, a demand for surrender, and a species that did not yet know it was standing on top of the most powerful arsenal ever constructed. The display hit 100%. Every station in the command hub reported green. Aegis was fully online. Every node, every array, every houndsat, every relay, all of it connected, all of it aimed, all of it waiting for a single command. Osei looked at the holographic map of near-Earth space, where 10,000 red icons drifted in lazy formation around the planet, each one representing a Zarathi warship, crewed by thousands of beings who had no idea what was about to happen to them. She opened a channel to every Aegis installation in the solar system and spoke 6 words in a voice that did not waver. Confirm target lock on all contacts. The replies came back from 12 different worlds and moons and asteroid stations simultaneously, each one a steady voice speaking to locked, 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 locked. 12 times the word echoed through the command hub. Osei closed her eyes for 1 second, just one, and thought about the astronomers 40 years ago who had first heard the signals and understood what they meant. They had given humanity a warning, and humanity had not wasted it. She opened her eyes and opened a channel to the Zarathi fleet. Admiral Velcor, your deadline was 1 rotation. You gave us 6 hours. That was more than we needed. I am going to say something now, and I want you to pay very close attention. She paused, not for drama, but to let the translation systems catch up. You said you have 10,000 warships encircling Earth. Another pause. You had 10,000. She closed the channel and gave the order. And beneath the surface of 12 worlds, the machines that humanity had built in the dark finally opened their eyes. Grand Admiral Velcor had just enough time to feel confused before the universe tore itself apart around him. The human woman's transmission had barely ended, her strange words still hanging in the air of the command deck, when every alarm on the divine mandate screamed to life at the same time. The tactical display that showed his beautiful fleet in perfect formation around Earth suddenly went insane. Icons flickering, jumping, overlapping, disappearing, as if the computer itself could not understand what it was seeing. Because what it was seeing was impossible. Space folded, not in the way the Zarathi understood folding, the gentle bending of dimensions that allowed their ships to cross between stars, but in a way that was violent and cruel and surgical, all at once. The entire formation, warships that had been holding steady positions for hours, suddenly stopped being where they were supposed to be. The Zarathi dreadnought, Iron Conviction, a vessel that had conquered 11 worlds on its own, found itself occupying the exact same coordinates as the siege carrier Burning Truth. For one impossible fraction of a second, two ships existed in the same space. Then, physics resolved the contradiction in the only way it could, with an explosion so violent that it vaporized both vessels and everything within 100 kilometers of them. And it was not just those two ships. All across the formation, the same thing was happening. Ships dragged sideways through folded space and slammed into each other like toys thrown together by the hand of an angry god. The loom was firing. Thousands of spatial distortion nodes buried across the solar system, working in perfect coordination through the ghost line, each one folding a tiny piece of space just enough to shift a Zarathi warship a few thousand kilometers in a random direction. It did not sound like much. A few thousand kilometers was nothing in the vastness of space, but the loom was not moving ships to random empty coordinates. It was moving them into each other. 2,400 warships died in the first 38 seconds. They did not die in battle. They did not fire a single shot. They did not even have time to raise their shields. They simply ceased to exist as separate objects, merged into twisted masses of fused metal and burning fuel that tumbled through orbit like the wreckage of a nightmare. On the command deck of the Divine Mandate, Velkor gripped the arms of his chair so hard his claws cracked the metal. His tactical officers were screaming, damage reports flooding in from every sector of the fleet, communications channels drowning in distress calls from ships that were already gone by the time anyone heard them. "What is happening?" he roared at his intelligence cast, the same analysts who had assured him that humanity was defenseless. They had no answer. Their instruments showed nothing. No enemy ships, no weapons platforms, no missiles, no source of attack at all. Just the impossible reality of warships being pulled through space and crushed together by a force that did not appear to exist. Before anyone could form a coherent response, the second phase began. From the surface of Earth, from the gray dust of the Moon, from the red plains of Mars, from the frozen shell of Europa, beams of light erupted upward into space. But they were not ordinary light. They were something that Zarathi science had no name for. Concentrated stellar energy, shaped and directed through graviton-photonic fusion into beams that carried a fraction of the sun's own power, focused into lines thinner than a ship's hull. The Sable arrays had fired. Zarathi shields were among the most advanced in the galaxy, layered energy barriers designed to absorb kinetic impacts, disperse plasma, and deflect particle beams. Never failed against any weapon wielded by any species the Dominion had ever encountered. The Sable beams did not care about Zarathi shields. They passed through them as if they were not there, not because they overpowered the shields, but because they operated on principles the shields had never been designed to counter. Where the beams touched a warship, molecular bonds simply stopped working. Atoms that had been held together in the structure of metal and circuitry and living tissue suddenly forgot how to hold on to each other. Ships did not explode when hit by Sable fire. They dissolved, hulls turning to gray dust that drifted apart in silos. Entire vessels coming undone like sandcastles in a rising tide. Velkor watched through the viewport of his flagship as the dreadnought Sovereign Will, a ship he had served on as a young officer, a ship with a crew of 12,000, simply fell apart in front of his eyes. One moment it was there, massive and dark and bristling with weapons. The next moment it was a cloud of gray particles expanding slowly into the void, as if it had never been solid at all. 3,100 warships dissolved in 97 seconds. The Sable beams fired in sweeping patterns, not randomly, but with precise targeting, that suggested every single ship in the fleet had been individually marked long before the first shot was fired. Velkor's fleet had lost more than half its strength in less than 3 minutes, and had not yet identified a single target to shoot back at. Then the third phase arrived. From the direction of the asteroid belt, millions of kilometers away, something was coming. The long-range sensors picked them up first, a wave of small objects accelerating inward toward the fleet at a speed that made Velkor's blood turn cold. They were moving at nearly a third of the speed of light. Houndsats arrived like a storm of metal hornets, each one the size of a ball that human children might kick around a field, each one carrying a micro-singularity warhead that could create a black hole the size of a grain of sand for 1/1000th of a second. 1/1000th of a second was enough. Point defense guns across the surviving fleet opened fire, filling space with a wall of energy and projectiles that destroyed Houndsats by the thousands. For every one they killed, 100 more came screaming in behind it. The Houndsats did not need to be smart, they just needed to be many, and they were so impossibly many that the space between the surviving warships turned into a blizzard of tiny machines moving too fast for the eye to follow. When a Houndsat reached its target and detonated, a pinprick of absolute darkness appeared against the hull of a warship. A micro-singularity that existed for a nanosecond and swallowed everything within a sphere the size of a room before collapsing. 1 Houndsat could punch a hole through a hull. 10 could gut a reactor. 100 could reduce a dreadnought to a hollow shell. 3,800 warships shredded apart under the swarm, torn open from the inside and outside simultaneously by millions of tiny wounds that added up to annihilation. By the time the swarm passed, the space around Earth looked like a graveyard, a vast field of broken metal and drifting debris and slowly fading explosions that stretched from low orbit to beyond the moon. Of the 10,000 warships that Grand Admiral Velkor had brought to conquer Earth, 700 remained. They were damaged, shields failing, weapons offline, engines sputtering, and they were trying desperately to run. The loom activated one final time. But this time, it did not crush anything. It simply held. Every surviving ship felt space tighten around it like invisible hands, gripping a struggling animal. Spatial anchors locking each vessel in place so firmly that no amount of engine power could move them even a centimeter. 700 warships hung frozen in the void, unable to move, unable to flee, unable to do anything except listen, as Commander Lyra Osei's voice returned to the open channel one last time. 700 remaining. I have left these ones alive deliberately, Admiral. Someone needs to go home and explain what happened here. Someone needs to make sure the Zarathi Dominion understands something very important about this species. The channel was silent for a long moment. We do not start wars, Admiral, but we end them in ways that make sure no one ever tries again. The spatial anchors released. The 700 ships drifted free. Not one of them hesitated. Every single surviving vessel turned away from Earth and ran as fast as its damaged engines could carry it, fleeing into the dark between. Stars like animals, escaping a fire. The entire engagement, from the first fold of space to the release of the last anchor, had lasted 6 minutes and 14 seconds. In the command hub beneath the Swiss Alps, 3,000 operators sat in silence for a long time. Then someone in the back of the room started clapping, and then everyone was clapping, and Commander Osei sat in her chair at the center of it all, and stared at the display where 10,000 red icons had become 700 fleeing dots, and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 26 years of service. Grand Admiral Velkor did not speak for the entire journey home. He sat in his command chair aboard the Divine Mandate, a chair that had once felt like a throne and now felt like a coffin, and stared at nothing while his surviving officers worked in terrified silence around him. The flagship was damaged but functional, one of the lucky ones, and it limped through folded space at reduced speed, alongside the other 699 warships that were all that remained of the greatest armada the Zarathi Dominion had ever assembled. No one spoke about what had happened. No one needed to. Every single crew member on every single surviving ship had watched the same thing, had seen space itself turn against them, had seen warships dissolve like mist in sunlight, had seen a swarm of tiny machines tear through the mightiest fleet in galactic history the way fire tears through paper. They had entered Earth's system as conquerors, leaving as witnesses. The journey back to Zarathi space took 11 days, and in those 11 days Velcor did only one thing besides sit in his chair. He wrote his report. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, because the truth was so simple and so humiliating that it barely needed words. We arrived. We demanded surrender. They asked for 6 hours. We gave them 6 hours. They destroyed 93% of our fleet in 6 minutes. They let us leave. He submitted the report upon arrival and was immediately summoned before the Dominion's ruling council, the Circle of 12, who governed 4,000 conquered worlds from their ancient capital on the Zarathi homeworld. They did not believe him. They could not believe him, because believing him meant accepting that a species they had classified as primitive and irrelevant had done something that no civilization in 12,000 years of Zarathi expansion had ever done. Said no, and they had made it stick. The Circle demanded the sensor recordings from every surviving ship, and when they watched them, the chamber fell silent in a way that Velcor suspected it had never been silent before. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the silence was very different. The world had watched the sky light up with explosions, had seen the flashes of sable fire lance upward from the ground, had felt the tremors as deeply buried installations fired weapons that shook the bedrock of continents. And then it was over, and the sky was clear, and the alien fleet was gone, and 7 billion people were left standing in the aftermath of a battle they had not known was coming, fought by weapons they had not known existed, operated by an organization they had not known was real. The secret broke within hours. Journalists, hackers, whistleblowers, and panicked government officials all contributed to the flood of information that poured across every network. On the planet, the existence of the Solar Defense Communion, the 40-year construction of Project Aegis, the secret cooperation between nations that had publicly pretended to distrust each other, while privately working together on the most important project in human history. The reaction was not simple. There was relief, enormous, overwhelming, tearful relief, because humanity was alive and free, and the alien conquerors were running away with their tails between their legs. But there was also rage. People wanted to know who had authorized this, who had decided that the world's governments could spend trillions in secret, could recruit thousands of scientists and engineers into classified programs, could build weapons of unimaginable power beneath the feet of ordinary people without telling a single one of them. Protests filled the streets of every major city on Earth. Politicians who had known about the communion were dragged before cameras and committees and demanded to explain themselves. And Commander Lyra Osei, whose name and face were now known to every human being on the planet, was summoned before a closed-session tribunal to answer for what she had done. She arrived in her uniform, sat down at the witness table, and faced a panel of judges and lawmakers who looked at her with expressions that ranged from gratitude to fury. The lead judge asked her a single question: by what authority had the Solar Defense Communion operated in secret for 40 years? Osei's answer was calm and direct. 40 years ago, we detected alien intelligence scouting our system. We had 2 choices: hope they were friendly or prepare for the possibility they were not. We chose to prepare. Every nation that participated did so voluntarily. The secrecy was necessary, not to hide from our own people, but to hide from them. She paused and let that settle. If the Zarathi had known what we were building, they would not have sent 10,000 ships. They would have sent 100,000. Or they would have simply sterilized the planet from outside our system. burning Earth from a distance we could never reach. We needed them to come close. We needed them to underestimate us. We needed them to be arrogant. And they were. The tribunal argued for weeks. Some called her a hero, the woman who had saved humanity from enslavement. Others called her a tyrant, someone who had wielded power in secret without democratic consent, who had made decisions that affected every human being alive without asking a single one of them. Osai accepted both labels without complaint. She had known from the day she took command that this moment would come, and that history would judge her however it chose. What mattered was that there was still a history to judge. In the end, the tribunal reached no formal verdict. The legal questions were too tangled. Arguments too evenly matched. The simple fact of survival too overwhelming to allow for clean conclusions. Osai was neither punished nor promoted. She was simply allowed to continue her work, now under the bright light of public scrutiny, rather than the comfortable darkness of secrecy. The world slowly, painfully, began to process what had happened and what it meant. Humanity was not alone in the universe. The universe was not friendly, and Earth had weapons that could bite back. But the consequences that mattered most were not happening on Earth. They were happening across the galaxy. The 700 surviving Zarathi warships had carried their recordings and their trauma back to the Dominion. And the story had spread from there, like a fire that no one could contain. Within weeks, every major civilization in 3 galaxies knew what had happened at Earth, a pre-interstellar species, a species that had never left its own system. Classified as primitive by every galactic standard, had destroyed 9,300 Zarathi warships in 6 minutes. The recordings played on alien screens across thousands of worlds. The impossible folding of space, the beams of stellar fire, the swarm of tiny machines, and most haunting of all, the calm voice of a human woman, announcing the destruction of the most powerful fleet ever assembled, as if she were reading a weather report. For the Zarathi Dominion, the effect was devastating. They had built their empire on a simple foundation, the absolute certainty that no species could resist them. And that foundation had just cracked down the middle. On a dozen conquered worlds, enslaved species who had long ago given up hope, watched the recordings, and felt something they had not felt in generations. They felt possibility. If the humans could say no, if one small species on one small world could stand against the Dominion and win, then maybe the Dominion was not as invincible as it claimed. Maybe resistance was not a mathematical impossibility after all. The first rebellion began on a mining world called Keth, where a species of 6-limbed insectoids who had been enslaved for 300 years refused to enter the mines one morning and instead tore the Zarathi overseers apart with their bare hands. The second rebellion began on a gas giant's moon, where aquatic beings who had been harvested for their biological compounds sabotaged the processing facilities and declared independence. The third began on the Zarathi homeworld itself, where a servant caste that had been considered too broken to resist quietly poisoned the water supply of a military installation. Within a year, the Dominion was fighting on 12 fronts simultaneously, not against humanity, but against its own conquered subjects who had finally remembered that surrender was a choice and not a law of nature. Started because one species, on one small blue world, had looked at 10,000 warships and decided that the correct response was not fear. It was correction. On Earth, Commander Osei watched the reports of galactic rebellion filter in through the Communion's intelligence networks and felt the full weight of what humanity had set in motion. They had not just defended themselves, they had changed the equation for everyone. 5 years changed everything and nothing. Humanity stepped onto the galactic stage not with warships or threats or demands, but with open hands and curious eyes, and the same restless energy that had driven them to cross every ocean and climb every mountain on their own small world. The Solar Defense Communion was dissolved by international vote and replaced by a new institution called the Terran Accord, a publicly funded, civilian-overseen organization responsible for Earth's defense and its diplomatic relations with the wider galaxy. Aegis still existed, every node, every array, every hounsat, but it now operated under transparent authority, with elected oversight committees and published budgets and rules of engagement that any citizen could read. Commander Lyra Osei retired on the day the Accord was formally established. She walked out of the facility beneath the Swiss Alps for the last time, stepped into the sunlight, and went home to a small house in Accra, where she planned to grow vegetables and read books, and never think about spatial distortion targeting systems again. The galaxy, meanwhile, did not know what to make of humanity. Human traders appeared at alien space stations with cargoes of strange and wonderful things. Music and spices and art and stories and medicines derived from the absurd biological diversity of their home world. Human diplomats sat at negotiating tables and argued passionately for fair trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, and the rights of species that had been conquered by the Dominion. Human doctors showed up on war-torn worlds and set up field hospitals and treated anyone who needed help, regardless of species or politics or which side of which conflict they were on. Human engineers arrived on impoverished colonies and helped build water purification systems and power grids and communication networks, and asked for nothing in return except friendship and maybe a local recipe they could bring home. They were warm and loud and laughed easily and cried at sad stories and kept small animals as companions and decorated their living spaces with plants and colored fabrics and images of loved ones. They were, by any measure, one of the friendliest species the galaxy had ever encountered, and every single civilization that interacted with them did so with a small, cold nod of awareness sitting in the back of their collective consciousness, because they had all seen the recordings. They had all watched 10,000 warships die in 6 minutes at the hands of these same friendly, laughing, plant-keeping creatures. The contrast was the thing that stayed with people. The absolute disconnect between the species they met at trade negotiations and the species that had engineered the annihilation of the most powerful fleet in galactic history, with the calm efficiency of someone tidying a room. It was as if humanity existed in two states at once, gentle and terrible, and which one you got depended entirely on which one you provoked. The Zarathi Dominion, weakened by 5 years of spreading rebellions inspired by humanity's example, finally sent an envoy to Earth. Not a fleet, they would never make that mistake again, but a single diplomatic shuttle, carrying a single passenger. Her name was Talik, and she was one of the oldest members of the Zarathi ruling council, a being who had overseen the conquest of hundreds of worlds, and who now found herself sitting in a small conference room in Geneva, across a table from a human who was offering her tea. The human was David Achebe, a former communion officer who had been appointed as Earth's first Terran ambassador, a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle voice, who had personally overseen the targeting of 3,000 Zarathi warships during the 6-minute battle 5 years ago. He poured tea for both of them and sat down and smiled, as if he were meeting a friend for lunch. Talik studied him for a long time, trying to reconcile the warm creature in front of her with the species that had torn her civilization's sense of invincibility apart like wet cloth. Finally she spoke. Your species had those weapons for 40 years. You could have reached out. You could have announced yourselves, joined the galactic community, used your technology to build an empire that would rival our own. Why did you not? Achebe took a sip of his tea and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because we have already done the empire thing, he said. Several times, actually. We have a long history of one group of humans conquering another group of humans and calling it civilization. And it always ends the same way. Badly, and for everyone. The conquerors become cruel, and the conquered become angry, and eventually the whole thing tears itself apart, and everyone has to start over from the... He set his cup down. We did not build Aegis to conquer. We built it so that no one could conquer us. There is a difference. We have learned, painfully, over thousands of years of doing it wrong, that the only fight worth preparing for is the one you hope never comes. Talik absorbed this, and if it comes again, she asked. Achebe looked at her and smiled, a warm, genuine smile that somehow managed to be the most unsettling thing Talik had ever seen. Then I would suggest bringing more than 10,000. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Talik did something that surprised herself. She laughed. It was a small sound, rusty and unfamiliar, because Zerathi did not laugh often, and ruling council members laughed even less. But it came out of her before she could stop it. Achebe laughed too, and for a brief strange moment, two beings whose species had been at war sat in a small room in Geneva and shared something that felt almost like understanding. The negotiations that followed were long and difficult, years of argument and compromise and setback and progress. But they happened, and that was the thing that mattered. The Zerathi Dominion did not collapse. It transformed, slowly and painfully, from an empire built on conquest into something more complicated and more sustainable, a federation of sorts, where conquered species gained representation and autonomy in exchange for continued economic cooperation. It was not perfect. It was messy and contentious and full of old wounds that would take generations to heal. But it was better than what had come before, and it had started because one species had refused to kneel. Across the galaxy, humanity's reputation solidified into something that no other species had ever quite achieved. They were trusted, because they kept their promises and dealt fairly, and showed up to help when help was needed. They were liked, because they were curious and enthusiastic, and had an infectious love of life that made other species feel more alive just by being around them. And they were feared, not with the kind of fear that makes people hostile, but with the kind that makes them respectful. The deep, quiet understanding that the friendly creature across the table was also the creature that had built a weapon capable of folding space itself and had used it with 6 minutes of devastating precision. Humanity was a species that kept flowers on their windowsills and wolves in their blood. They would feed you, and heal you, and sing with you, and never raise a hand in anger. But if you raised yours first, if you came to their home with warships and demands, and the arrogant assumption that they would kneel because every other species had knelt before them, they would correct you. And the correction would be so thorough and so absolute that the story of it would echo across galaxies for 1,000 years. In the great library on the neutral world of Fesson, where the histories of every known species were recorded and preserved for future generations, the entry for humanity was updated 5 years after the Battle of Earth. It was a long entry, full of details about human history, culture, biology, technology, and diplomatic relationships. But at the very bottom, after all the facts and figures and analysis, there was a single footnote that every species in the galaxy eventually read. It said simply, "They are kind. Do not mistake this for weakness." And across the galaxy, in embassy halls and trading posts and military academies, and the quiet rooms where rulers made their decisions, that footnote was remembered. It was remembered by the Zerathi, who had learned its truth at the cost of 9,300 warships. It was remembered by the liberated species, who had found their courage in humanity's example. By every civilization that looked at the small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, and understood that the most dangerous thing in the universe is not the creature that roars and bares its teeth. It is the creature that smiles and offers you tea and means it with absolute sincerity, right up until the moment you give it a reason not to. And so the galaxy turned, vast and ancient and full of wonders, and humanity walked through it with open hands and worn hearts, and the quiet knowledge that buried beneath their feet On every world they had ever touched, the machines were always listening, always ready, always waiting, just in case someone needed to be corrected again.